there is a book that was never meant for your eyes. It was written in the dead of night, in military tents at the edge of empire, by a man who commanded the most powerful nation on earth. And yet felt, in his own words, like a student who had barely begun to learn. He wrote it not for glory, not for publication, not for history. He wrote it as a private reckoning, a man at war not with his enemies, but with himself. That man was Marcus Aurelius, and that book is the Meditations. For nearly 2,000 years, these words have survived empires, wars, plagues, and the collapse of civilizations. And what is extraordinary is not just that they survived, it is that they remain, even now, devastatingly relevant, not as philosophy preserved in amber, but as a living, breathing instruction manual for the hardest parts of being human. But here is what most people miss. Most people read the Meditations and find comfort. They find quotes to put on their walls, captions for their posts, words that feel good in the moment. What they miss, what Marcus himself spent his entire life wrestling with, are the deeper lessons buried beneath the surface, the lessons that are not comfortable, the lessons that demand something of you. These are the 15 lessons Marcus Aurelius did not want you to ignore. Not because he wanted to hide them, but because he knew, he understood from his own experience, that most people would rather look away. Do not look away. Welcome to Stoic Zeno. If this is your first time here, this channel exists for one reason. To bring you philosophy that actually changes how you live. Not inspiration that fades by tomorrow. Real, ancient, tested wisdom that cuts through the noise of the modern world. If that is what you are looking for, subscribe to the channel right now, hit the like button on this video, and share it with someone in your life who needs to hear this. Leave a comment below and tell me, which Stoic lesson has had the greatest impact on your life. I read every single one. Now, let us begin. Lesson 1. You are not your thoughts. You are what you do with them. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that, if you truly understand it, will change the way you experience every single day of your life. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But there is a deeper layer beneath these words that most people overlook. Marcus did not say you have power over your thoughts. He said you have power over your mind, and there is a crucial difference. Thoughts arrive uninvited, fear comes, anger rises, bitterness surfaces. These are the natural movements of a human mind, and Marcus Aurelius, emperor, general, philosopher, experienced every one of them. He wrote about waking up reluctant to face the day. He wrote about his frustration with people who disappointed him. He wrote about the temptation to despair. What made Marcus extraordinary was not that he did not have these thoughts. It was that he understood his relationship to them. A thought is not a command. A feeling is not a fact. The moment you observe a thought rather than becoming it, you have stepped into the inner citadel that the Stoics spoke of. The fortress within yourself that no external force can breach. The practical application of this lesson is immediate. The next time anger rises in you, do not suppress it and do not act from it. Pause. Observe it. Name it. Say internally, there is anger in me right now. That single act of naming creates distance. And in that distance is your freedom. Marcus called this the discipline of perception. Train your perception, and you train your entire life. Lesson 2. The obstacle is not in your way, it is the way. This is perhaps the most famous Stoic idea in modern culture, largely because Ryan Holiday brought it to a contemporary audience, but the original insight belongs entirely to Marcus Aurelius, and it is far more radical than most people realize. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Most of us live our lives in a state of permanent negotiation with reality. We have a plan, and we want the world to cooperate. When it does not, when the obstacle appears, when the failure comes, when the person we counted on lets us down, we treat that obstacle as an interruption of our life. We wait for it to pass, we resent it while it lasts. We measure our progress by how quickly we can get back to the path we intended. Marcus Aurelius rejected this entirely. He did not merely tolerate obstacles. He trained himself to see them as the curriculum. The obstacle is not interrupting your education. The obstacle is your education. A man who has never faced resistance does not know his own strength. A mind that has never been does not know its own depth. A character shaped only by comfort is a character that has never truly been formed. Think about the difficulties in your life right now. Not the catastrophic ones. The persistent, grinding ones. The relationship that strains you. The work that frustrates you. The circumstance you keep wishing were different. Marcus would look at that difficulty and ask one question. What is this teaching me that nothing else could? That shift is not passive acceptance. It is active engagement. It is turning toward the difficulty with full attention and demanding from it what it has to offer. That is the Stoic way. Lesson 3. Most of your suffering is manufactured in your mind. This lesson is uncomfortable, and Marcus knew it. That is precisely why he kept returning to it, in different forms, across the meditations. He wrote, "If you are pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs you, but your own judgment about it, and it is in your power to wipe out that judgment now." Now before you resist this, and I know the resistance will come, let me be clear about what Marcus is and is not saying. He is not saying that pain is an illusion. He is not saying that loss is not real, that grief is not valid, that suffering should be dismissed. Marcus buried children. He watched plagues decimate his empire. He knew suffering in a way that most of us will never be asked to endure. What he is saying is more precise and more powerful than simple dismissal. He is saying that between the event and your suffering, there is always a judgment. Something happens. And then, almost instantaneously, your mind adds a story. This is catastrophic. This should not have happened. This is unfair. I cannot bear this. And it is that story, not the event itself, that produces most of what we call suffering. The Stoics called this the discipline of assent, the practice of examining what you are agreeing to before you agree to it. When the thought arises that this situation is unbearable, you are allowed to pause and ask, is it? Truly? Or is my mind catastrophizing? Is this permanent, or is this a moment I am living through? This is not cold indifference. It is a profound form of self-respect. You are refusing to be the passive victim of your own mental commentary. Lesson 4. Time is the one thing that cannot be recovered. Marcus Aurelius was obsessed with time. Not in a neurotic, anxious way, but in the way that a man who has thought deeply about mortality becomes obsessed. He understood, with complete clarity, that the hours of a life are finite in a way that nothing else is. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, and elsewhere, how many a Fabius, Scipio, Cato have time swallowed up." This is the practice of memento mori. Remember that you will die, which is central to Stoic philosophy. But Marcus applied it not to death in the abstract, but to the present moment in the specific. He was not interested in contemplating death as a future event. He was interested in what the reality of death tells you about how to live right now. Today, in this hour, we live in a civilization that is extraordinarily skilled at consuming time while producing the illusion of meaning. We scroll. We plan. We worry about futures that may never arrive. We replay conversations from pasts that no longer exist. And all the while, the present, the only moment in which anything real can actually happen, passes by unoccupied. Marcus would look at your life and ask one devastatingly simple question. What are you doing with the time that is actually yours? Not the time you plan to have, not the time you had yesterday, the time you have right now. The Stoic practice is to return to the present moment, not as a retreat from life, but as the fullest possible engagement with it. Lesson 5. The people who infuriate you are your greatest teachers. This one will test you. Marcus Aurelius lived surrounded by people who, by any reasonable standard, were exhausting. Sycophants, who told him what he wanted to hear, advisors who pursued their own interests, political opponents who undermined him at every turn, and ordinary people, the rude, the ungrateful, the petty, the dishonest, whom he encountered every day. He did not pretend to be unaffected. He wrote about it honestly. But he also wrote this. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. Read that again. He anticipated difficulty with people. Not so that he could dread it, but so that he could meet it without being destroyed by it. And then he continued. But I have seen the beauty of good, and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. There it is, the difficult person is not your enemy. They are, in the deepest Stoic sense, a mirror. They reflect something, impatience, pride, the need for control, that exists in you as well, because you both share the same human nature. The person who triggers you most completely is, if you are honest, teaching you exactly where your own work lies. Lesson 6. Your reputation is not your character. In the ancient world, reputation was everything. Honor, social standing, the opinion of peers. These were the currencies of Roman aristocratic life. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in that world. His reputation was, in a literal sense, the foundation of his authority, and yet he wrote this. I have often wondered how it is that every man loves himself more than all the rest of men, but yet sets less value on his own opinion of himself than on the opinion of others. This is a man who saw through the machinery of social approval, even while living at its very center. The distinction Marcus draws is between external reputation and internal character. Reputation is what others believe about you. Character is what you actually are when no one is watching, and the Stoic argument, an argument Marcus tested every single day of his reign, is that only one of these things is genuinely yours. Your reputation can be destroyed by a rumor. It can be damaged by an enemy, a misunderstanding, a moment of bad luck. It is, by its very nature, dependent on the perception of others, and the perception of others is outside your control. Your character, on the other hand, is built or destroyed only by your own choices. No one can take it from you. No one can give it to you. Marcus built his life around this distinction. He chose, repeatedly, to act well, even when acting well was invisible, even when no one would know, even when the politically expedient choice was different from the ethical one. That is character. And that is the only thing worth building. Lesson 7. Desire less, and you will have more. The Stoics had a precise word for this. Apatheia, which is not apathy in the modern sense but the freedom from being enslaved by appetite. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme constantly, because he lived in an environment of maximum temptation. As emperor, he could have anything. The entire wealth of an empire was at his disposal. He wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. And, seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." The modern world is built on a single premise, that the acquisition of more will produce the experience of enough. More money, more status, more followers, more experiences, more options. The economy of desire is infinite, and its promise is always the same. Satisfaction is just one more acquisition away. Marcus watched this mechanism at work in the people around him, and more honestly, in himself, and he identified it for exactly what it is. A trap, not because desire is evil, but because desire that is untrained produces a life of permanent insufficiency. You will always want more than you have, and a man who always wants more than he has is, by definition, a man who never has enough. The Stoic practice here is not asceticism for its own sake, it is the deliberate cultivation of appreciation for what already exists. The Stoics called this negative visualization, the practice of imagining the loss of what you value in order to restore your genuine appreciation of it. Imagine your health gone. Imagine the relationships you take for granted, absent. Imagine the simple pleasures of an ordinary day, a meal, a conversation, the light through a window, removed. What you are left with, after that exercise, is gratitude. And gratitude is the antidote to the endless hunger of unexamined desire. Lesson 8. Act for the common good, or you are acting against yourself. Marcus Aurelius was deeply committed to what the Stoics called sympatheia, the interconnectedness of all rational beings. This is not a soft or sentimental idea. It is, in the Stoic framework, a metaphysical claim, that human beings are not isolated atoms but nodes in a living network of mutual dependence. He wrote, "What injures the hive injures the bee." And, we are made for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of the upper and lower teeth. This is the aspect of Stoicism that is most often overlooked in modern adaptations, which tend to focus on individual resilience and personal virtue. Marcus certainly believed in those things, but he believed in them in service of something larger. Virtue was not a personal achievement to be accumulated. It was an expression of your nature as a social being, and your nature as a social being demanded that you act, always, in ways that served the whole. In practical terms, this means that every action you take either contributes to, or subtracts from the fabric of the community around you. The way you treat the person who serves you coffee. The way you behave in traffic. The way you speak about others when they are not in the room. These are not trivial, they are the daily expression of whether you understand yourself as part of something larger than yourself. Marcus held himself to this standard relentlessly. He chose, again and again, the good of Rome over his own comfort, his own preference, his own private interest. Not because he was naturally selfless. He was honest about his own desires. But because he understood that this was what his nature, rightly understood, demanded. Lesson 9. You will die. And that is not a tragedy. Memento mori, remember death. This is perhaps the most misunderstood element of Stoic practice in contemporary culture, where it is often reduced to a mildly edgy reminder to live in the moment. Marcus went much further. He wrote, "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life, now take what's left and live it properly." And, loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight. For Marcus, the contemplation of death was not a morbid exercise. It was a philosophical clarification. Death is the lens through which the meaning of life becomes sharp. Without death, nothing has weight. Without the knowledge that this moment will not come again, there is no urgency to inhabit it fully. Without the certainty of endings, nothing has the quality of being precious. The Stoics also used this contemplation to dissolve the pretensions of ego. When Marcus thought about the great emperors and conquerors who came before him, men whose names once filled the world, and saw how completely time had consumed them, he was not plunged into nihilism. He was liberated. Liberated from the desperate need for legacy, for recognition, for vindication. If even the greatest are forgotten, then there is nothing to prove. There is only the quality of this life, in this moment, with these people, in these circumstances. That is not tragedy. That is freedom. Lesson 10. Discipline is not punishment. It is the highest form of self-respect. Marcus Aurelius begins the Meditations with something remarkable. A long acknowledgement of everyone who taught him, shaped him, and formed his character. His grandfather taught him gentleness, his father taught him modesty and manliness. His teachers taught him endurance, self-denial, and the discipline to want little. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present. And, do not indulge in dreams of what you have not, but reckon up the chief of the blessings you do possess, and then thankfully remember how eagerly you would have desired them had they not been yours." But the discipline Marcus practiced was not the grim, joyless self-denial that the word often implies in modern culture. It was something more fundamental. It was the discipline of a craftsman, a person who has chosen mastery and who understands that mastery requires showing up repeatedly, even when it is inconvenient, even when motivation is absent, even when the results are not immediately visible. We live in a culture that has confused inspiration with discipline. We wait to feel motivated before we act. We mistake the desire to improve for the actual work of improvement. Marcus had no patience for this. He understood, from his own daily struggle, recorded in the Meditations, with startling honesty, that the gap between who you are and who you could be is not crossed by intention. It is crossed by repeated, sustained, unglamorous action. Discipline is not punishment. It is the daily act of choosing who you are going to become, over who you would be, if you simply followed every impulse. Lesson 11. Forgive the people who harm you. Not for their sake, but for yours. This is a lesson that carries enormous psychological power, and Marcus arrived at it not through sentiment, but through reason. He wrote, "Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself the following question. What fault of mine most nearly resembles the one I am about to criticize? And the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." Marcus was not naive about human cruelty. He dealt with betrayal, political sabotage, and the full range of human malice throughout his reign. He was not suggesting that you become passive, or that you permit harm to continue unchallenged. He was making a precise psychological argument. The person who has harmed you lives in you, rent-free, for every day that you maintain your resentment. The injury may have lasted a moment. The bitterness, if you cultivate it, lasts a lifetime, and it is not your enemy who pays that price, it is you. Marcus linked this to his broader understanding of human nature. People do harm, in the Stoic view, not from genuine evil but from ignorance. From a failure to see clearly, to reason well, to understand their own nature. This does not excuse the harm, but it does change how you relate to the person who caused it. You can hold them accountable, and simultaneously release your claim on resentment. Forgiveness, for Marcus, was an act of self-liberation. It was the refusal to allow someone else's failure to diminish the quality of your own inner life. Lesson 12. The present moment is the only real thing you own. We have touched on time already, but this lesson deserves its own space because Marcus returned to it with such persistent intensity throughout the meditations. He wrote, "Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present. And, confine yourself to the present. The past is fixed. You cannot alter it. Every moment spent in regret is a moment stolen from the only time you actually have access to. The future is uncertain. You cannot control it. Every moment spent in anxiety about what might happen is a moment of presence surrendered to a fiction. What remains is the present. This breath, this conversation, this task, this person in front of you." Marcus understood, and this was not an easy understanding, given the demands of ruling an empire, that the quality of a life is determined not by its scale, but by its depth of presence. A man who is fully present in an ordinary moment is living more richly than a man who is distracted in the most extraordinary circumstance. The Stoics called this prosos. Self-attention, the practice of bringing deliberate awareness to the present moment, not as a mystical practice but as a rational discipline. You are here. Now. This is the only place anything real can happen. Be here. Lesson 13. Your virtues must be active, not decorative. One of the great dangers of studying philosophy, and Marcus saw this clearly in the intellectual culture around him, is the temptation to confuse knowing about virtue with actually practicing it. He wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." This is possibly the most direct sentence in the entire Meditations. And it is directed, above all, at himself. Marcus spent years in education. He studied Stoicism under some of the finest philosophical minds of his age. He was surrounded by people who could discourse brilliantly on the nature of virtue, the good life, the ideal character, and what he concluded, with the weariness of a man who has sat through too many dinner-party debates, was that all of it is worthless unless it is translated into action. The Stoics had a term for this: the discipline of action. Virtue is not a belief you hold or a quality you aspire to. It is something you do, repeatedly, in specific situations, with specific people, under specific pressures. You are not courageous because you believe in courage. You are courageous because, in the moment when fear would have caused you to retreat, you acted differently. Your philosophy is what you do. Everything else is commentary. Lesson 14. Amor Fati. Learn to love what cannot be changed. Amor Fati. Love of fate. This is the hardest Stoic lesson, and Marcus spent his entire life working toward it. He wrote, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, and do so with all your heart, and everything harmonizes with me that is harmonious to thee, O universe." Amor Fati is not resignation. This is the distinction that most people miss, and it is everything. Resignation says, "I don't like this, but I have no choice, so I will endure it." Amor Fati says something far more radical: "I choose to love this. Not because it is what I would have chosen, but because it is what is. Because to be alive in this moment, in these circumstances, with these challenges, is the whole of what I have been given. And I will not spend my one life in resentment of the life I actually have." Marcus practiced this during the Antonine Plague, which killed millions and devastated his empire. He practiced it during the military campaigns that took him away from the philosophy and the quiet life he would have preferred. He practiced it in the face of betrayal, personal loss, physical illness, and the daily grind of obligations that never let up. He did not pretend these things were good. He chose to meet them without resistance. And in choosing that, he transformed the nature of his experience from suffering into something that resembled, however imperfectly, acceptance. That is not weakness. That is the most demanding form of strength there is. Lesson 15. The inner work never ends. And that is the point here, is the final lesson, and perhaps the most important one. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations near the end of his life, after decades as emperor, after a lifetime of study and practice. And what strikes every careful reader of that book is that he had not arrived, he had not solved himself. He was still working, still struggling, still catching himself in old patterns, still wrestling with impatience and frustration and the temptation to despair. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Not as a proclamation of achievement. As a reminder to himself that he had not yet fully mastered this. This is, I think, the most honest and most important gift that Marcus Aurelius left us. He did not present himself as a sage who had transcended human difficulty. He presented himself as a man who had committed, every single day, to the practice of becoming better, knowing that the work would not be completed in his lifetime, and doing it anyway. This is the Stoic understanding of philosophy. Not as a destination, but as a direction. Not as a state to be achieved but as a practice to be maintained. The goal is not to become a perfect Stoic. The goal is to be more honest, more just, more resilient, more present today than you were yesterday, and then, tomorrow, to do it again. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal, because he needed to. Because the practice of putting these thoughts into words, of holding himself accountable on the page, of returning, again and again, to the principles that he believed, and the ways he was falling short of them, was the practice itself. The meditations are not a finished product, they are the record of a practice. And that record is its own invitation. Begin the practice, not tomorrow, not when conditions are better, not when you feel ready. Now here is what these 15 lessons, taken together, actually mean for your life. They mean that you are more capable than your circumstances have allowed you to believe. They mean that the suffering you carry is not entirely outside your influence. They mean that the quality of your inner life, your character, your perceptions, your relationship to difficulty, is the only real currency that life ultimately asks for. Marcus Aurelius was not born a Stoic sage. He was born a human being, shaped by loss and privilege and pressure, who chose, repeatedly, to pursue wisdom over comfort. The gap between who he was and who he became was not crossed by talent or by luck. It was crossed by the daily, unglamorous, relentless practice of choosing better. That same choice is available to you. Right now, in the life you already have, with the circumstances you currently face, alongside the people who are already in your world. The Stoics did not promise you that life would be easy. They promised you something better. That if you train your mind, strengthen your character, and face your life with full attention and genuine commitment, then no matter what comes, no matter what fortune brings or takes, no matter what the world throws against you, there is something in you that cannot be touched, the inner citadel, your fortress, built not from stone, but from the quality of your choices. One day at a time, Marcus Aurelius spent his life building it. He wrote in the dark so that, 2,000 years later, you might find the light. Do not let that gift go to waste. If these 15 lessons from Marcus Aurelius moved something in you, if even one of them shifted how you see your life, then do one thing right now. Hit the like button on this video. It takes 1 second and it means the world to this channel. Share this video with someone in your life who is going through something difficult. Someone who needs the wisdom of the Stoics. More than they need another distraction. Subscribe to Stoic Zeno so that you never miss what comes next, because this community is being built for exactly the kind of person who made it to the end of this video. The kind of person who does not look away. Leave a comment below. Tell me which of these 15 lessons hit you hardest. Tell me where you are in your own practice. Tell me what you are working on. I will be in the comments, reading, responding, learning alongside you, because that is what this is. Not a channel, not content, a practice. A community of people who have chosen, the way Marcus chose, every morning, before the world made its demands. To work on themselves, Marcus Aurelius closed one of his meditations with something simple, something that carried, in its simplicity, the full weight of a life committed to philosophy. Do not act as if you had 10,000 years to live. You do not, but you have now. Use it. This is Stoic Zeno. And this practice, this philosophy, this relentless return to what actually matters. This is only the beginning.